Hi, this is week number 3 for September. And we are going to just do a quick review of where we've been for the month of September. So week 1, we went back to the 1600s and we went to France and we talked about Charles Perrault. And he, like many other storytellers, retold or reinvented previous stories that he had heard. So remember, fairy tales, like fables, were passed down from generation to generation, often retold. And I like Perrault's flair and how he added the glass slippers. Little details matter. And what I loved about that story was his characterization. That's just a brilliant example of an author showing the character qualities of Cinderella and the stepsisters. So that was kind of what we focused on there. And the second week, we went to Germany and we talked about Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, the brothers Grimm, and how they also retold fairy tales. Now they upped the game a little bit and they collected over 200, published them in a volume, which is why we're talking about them today. They documented them, right, for posterity. So we are familiar more so with the Brothers Grimm than our author today. So our author today is from Denmark. He was born in 1805. His name is Hans Christian Andersen. His stories, of course, were influenced by other fairy tales. What sets this author apart from Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm is he is the original author. Many of his stories are, in fact, autobiographical. And what that means is a biography is about a person's life. An autobiography is that person writing about their own life. So I initially had planned to do this story, The Ugly Duckling. And if you're familiar with that story, it's about a little duck who's born with his siblings, and they all look perfectly alike. And he is not attractive. And he's so ugly that he's bullied and ashamed and leaves. And then as he grows up into a beautiful swan. Well, this story is, in fact, autobiographical. Hans Christian Andersen was a homely little kid, not attractive, grew to be a handsome man, but understands what it feels like to be bullied. He was also known for placing his characters in desperate and hopeless situations. He faced a life of personal trauma. For example, his dad died when he was young, and he was forced to be a child laborer. And a child laborer is just someone who can't go to school. They have to go to work, and often not in great conditions. We're talking sweatshops or in the field, and making very, very minimal money. And this is likely why his characters sometimes are, they don't win or they go through harsh circumstances. One of the stories he wrote in 1837, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with, and that is The Little Mermaid. And there was a new version this summer that was released. His version, the original, is not the Disney kid version. In Andersen's version, an unnamed mermaid falls in love with a prince. She's offered the chance to take on human form. But in this story, the little mermaid will have to live in constant agony after having her tongue cut out. I think we can all agree that's a little extreme. And in the Disney version, Ursula the witch, curses her and steals her voice. She does get back. The mermaid's goal in Hans Christian Andersen's version is to gain immortality. And by doing this, she has to have the prince fall in love with her and marry her. This doesn't happen in his version. He marries someone else. So a horrible ending. The mermaid throws herself into the sea and dissolves within sea foam. And that's not the Disney happy version that we're all familiar with. This is kind of one of those times I actually prefer the Disney version. His fantastical fairy tales were written for children, I know, but they explore kind of different themes: poverty, inequality, charity, vanity. Anderson was famous for writing original stories, 156, comprising 9 volumes. They were translated in over 125 languages and adapted to plays, ballets, and films. He is a celebrated author. And I think for me personally, it's one thing to retell someone else's story, and it's an entirely different thing to write an original story. So for me, he's probably one I admire more than the other ones. So we're going to do a story today called The Nightingale. This was not my original plan, but the nightingale is a real bird. Okay, so I'm going to share with you my screen here. Let me give you just a little second so I can share.
We noticed she was kind of stumbling. She kind of had a head tilt, just a slight head tilt.
Let's share my screen. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a
right. Then by 10 o'clock.
Here we go. So this is, everyone, the nightingale. So not an extraordinarily beautiful bird, kind of ordinary looking. But could you duplicate those sounds? Could you replicate that? Close your eyes for a minute and just listen. Okay, so anyone who wants, I've given you the link, anyone who wants to kind of go through that, you are welcome to look at that. So in this story today, we're going to talk about a theme here throughout, which is, well, first of all, materialism. And we live in a very materialistic world today, which is ironic because this story was written in 1843, which means this is something that many cultures, work with. Materialism, it's on my board in here, so I'm going to sneak it in. It's a tendency to consider material possessions and physical comforts over what's right. Let me give you an example. We love our homes and our neighborhoods, right? Yet what did we destroy in nature to build those? Right? Deforestation. And that hurts our planet. We drive our nice cars, and even these electric cars, these Teslas, they actually have more carbon emissions than a regular car. And we like the comforts and the luxury of those cars, but they are destroying our atmosphere. So materialism is placing all of those things, the possessions that we have, the things that give us comfort, as more valuable than anything else. And this is really where this story is going to go today. I showed you an example of a real nightingale. So that's really important to the story. So in this story, we have a Chinese emperor who's very focused on material things. He is, the leader, and he wants his palace to be exquisitely beautiful and revered by other people. So it's built with porcelain tiles. It's exquisite. His gardens. If you've ever been to Japan or Chinese, their gardens are, man-made, sculpted, gorgeous. So he likes it when travelers come to visit China, and they talk about the exquisite beauty of the Chinese palace, of his gardens. They even talk about the natural wonders of the majestic forest and the trees and the sea. But he comes across a description of this nightingale who is declared as the most exquisite wonder of all. And he's like, I've never heard of it. I've never encountered it. So we're kind of left with, well, you're probably not leaving the palace, right? Leaving, we like our comforts. We like it surrounding us. So the rising action in the story, and I'm right here with the plot development if you want to follow where I'm at. The emperor requests his cavalier to find this mysterious nightingale bird with magnificent singing and bring her to the palace. He searches high and low around the palace. So people are kind of not in tune. Like, you got to go into nature to find the nightingale. So there's a little comedy in here. Finally, he encounters a young girl, a servant girl in the kitchen, who has heard the nightingale sing. So the servant girl noticed child labor. There's a little connection to Hans Christian Andersen. And she explains how the bird sings so beautifully, it brings tears to her eyes. So she leads him to the forest, and there's a couple more comedic elements. They come across a cow mooing, and he goes, "Is that the nightingale?" And she's like, "No." They come across a frog ribbiting, and he's like, "Is that the nightingale?" And she's like, "No." Finally, he hears the nightingale sing and realizes, oh, she is special. And he begs her to come sing for the emperor at the palace. And she really doesn't want to leave, and she warns him, my sound is best in nature. But she does go to the palace, and she becomes the focus of entertainment for the entire court. And she sits on this golden perch in the center of a great hall. So she is coveted. You know, this is the new toy, right, if you will. Now, to be clear, the climax of the story is very, very important, because as soon as the nightingale sings, the emperor, his eyes fill with tears and they roll down his face, and everyone is touched by the melodious sounds. So they realize, whoa, she is special. For the nightingale, that's the greatest compliment, to cry after she sings. So she goes along with his decision to keep her. And he doesn't just keep her, he traps her. He basically imprisons her, he cages her in. And there's scenes in the story that are really descriptive, that you're kind of like, oh, again, that materialism. I want it close to me. It gives me comfort. It makes me happy. I want it here. And I think we all know what happens when we trap something wild or an animal that's not intended to be put in a cage. And then there's this really interesting twist in the story. The Japanese emperor, hears about this beautiful nightingale and sends him an artificial replica. So this replica is, of course, ostentatious. It is bedazzled. It has rubies and sapphires and, crystals. And it has a wind-up, almost like a music box, which sings similar to a nightingale. If you've ever had a music box, they kind of tinkle. They kind of tinkle like a tinkle sound. They're very, very pretty. So all of a sudden, the artificial bird replaces the real nightingale. And they actually have them sing side by side. And not just the emperor, but the court, they're like, whoa, well, they almost sound alike. And they actually start to prefer the artificial bird. Now, remember, this is about appearances. This is about materialism. So the opulent, jeweled bird really was more, appropriate for the palace. It looked better, right? So no one notices when the real nightingale makes her escape, because they're all so gaga over the artificial bird. So the real nightingale was banished, and the artificial one was placed in a position of honor, not just in the palace hold on. I apologize, it just came at me. On the left side of the emperor's bed. And this is really important when you hold your hand over your heart, when you say the Pledge of Allegiance, it's a sign of respect, your heart. So if you put something beside your bed, it often means that's a treasure. That's where your treasure lies. So let's be clear. The emperor's treasure was an artificial wind-up bird, right? Think about what maybe your parents have by their bed. And a lot of people today have their phones by their bed. First thing they do is grab their phone. I'm not one of them. My phone is not in my room, period. When I go to sleep, no technology in my room. But I do think it's really easy to understand the materialism and why he was so focused on. As a matter of fact, he listened to it every night. It was kind of his gift to himself. So the falling action, after a year passes, the emperor, his court, and his Chinese countrymen memorize the songs from the artificial nightingale, and they're very happy with her. Every night he listens to her sing. One night he hears the sounds of the artificial bird's mechanical mechanism start to fail, and the music stops. You knew where this was going, right? This is artificial. Look what happens to your iPhone after a while, right? Technology and anything that's used over and over again, it wears out. So the watchmaker comes to fix it, and the emperor is told he's going to have to be more careful because the artificial bird will wear out with too much use. So they only play the artificial bird once a year. So they get used to this. So 5 years pass, and suddenly the emperor falls gravely ill. So much so, a new emperor has been chosen. So we see a couple times in the story, they find something new, then they replace it with something else. It gets old, they replace it with something else. They find something new, they replace it with something else. And again, that's what we do today. Our car starts to wear out, get a new one. We need a bigger house, we buy a new one, right? We're constantly upgrading. Yes, materialism. Okay, so they have a new emperor. So they all go to the new emperor. And they kind of do something really sad here. And they loved this emperor. They leave him alone on his deathbed. So the emperor lay alone in his bed, preparing to die at the end of the story, and he is visited by death. Symbolism here. Forced to face all of his past good and bad deeds, the emperor calls out to this artificial bird. Now pretend for a minute, this is the artificial bird, right? And he says, sing, sing, sing. He needs to be comforted. Well, first of all, it's artificial. And second of all, everybody's gone. No one's there to wind it up for him. So this is kind of a moment where this is the end. But it's not the end. Suddenly, outside of his window was the real nightingale, who'd heard of his illness and began to sing to the emperor a song of hope and trust. The music from the nightingale revived the emperor, strengthening him. She even convinced Death to leave. She continued to sing to the emperor as he grew stronger. This time, they agreed, she would sing only for him, and she would never be caged again, and she could come and go as she pleased. So the end of the story is kind of a happy ending, right? He's not replaced by a new emperor. He lives on. So what's the problem here? The emperor is materialistic and more concerned about possessions and the beauty man can create artificially. And he fails to appreciate the splendor of nature, what really matters. And aren't we just like him? So when he learned about an average-looking natural bird whose singing voice was considered more exquisite than anything man made, he wanted to encounter it. And then when he finally does encounter it, he is moved. He is moved to tears until the artificial bird is sent to him. And then this replaces the esteem he felt for the original, the natural nightingale. He doesn't need the real nightingale until he's dying. And only then does he realize the error of his ways and understand the power and the hope found in the nightingale. So it's really, of all his stories, pretty nice ending. Okay, so here we go. On the back of your outline, you will notice that I pulled the textual references for you. You'll notice on the front of your outline, it says, there is no lead, there is no conclusion. I don't want a lead and a conclusion. Kids are really struggling with using textual references. I really want the focus to be on the body content. Okay. So specific scenes in the story, The Nightingale, written by Hans Christian Andersen, compare the natural wonder of the nightingale's spectacular singing voice to the artificially created beauty, which clearly explains the message of the story to be what happens naturally can never be replaced, right? The descriptions of the bejeweled artificial nightingale replacement were shown to be highly valued by the emperor and his court. So you'll notice on this backside, there are 6 quotes. So for example, the very last quote at the bottom is what the emperor is saying on his deathbed. You little precious golden bird, sing, praise, sing. I've given you gold and costly presents. I've even hung my golden slipper around your neck. Sing, sing. He valued her more than anything else. And at the end of his life, she couldn't sing, right? No one was there to wind her up. So that would be the last point, because chronologically it's at the end of the story. If you go back to the top, when he received the artificial nightingale from the Japanese emperor, it said instead of a book, it was a work of art contained in a casket. An artificial nightingale made to look like a living one, covered all over with diamonds, rubies, and sapphires. So here's a clue. There's a symbol here. It's contained in a casket. Do you know what a casket is? It's a coffin. It's where they bury the body of someone who's passed. So I think, you kind of see the symbolism, the foreshadowing. So beginning and end. The music master says, when the nightingale and the artificial bird are singing together at the same time, they don't sound the same. And he says, that's not a fault. It is quite perfect to my taste. So then it had to sing alone and was as successful as the real bird. Besides, it was so much prettier to look at, for it sparkled like bracelets and breastpins. So what I hope you understand there is, when I introduced the quote, I explained the context, where that was placed in the story and what was happening. So you can't just say the blank said, comma, and give me the quote. You have to give the textual reference context. How is that relevant in the story? Then you introduce it, okay? But we have the best bird of all, said one, and then they would have the bird sing again, okay? And it was the 34th time they had listened to the same piece. Okay, I would end it there. So remember, you don't have to use the full quote, but if you kind of notice this is the fourth one, it's not as good as the other ones. Let me do the next one. But the music master praised the bird in the highest degree and even asserted it was better than a real nightingale, not only in its dress and the beautiful diamonds, but also in its musical power. Ooh. So this is the music master. He's praising it. He's basically saying it's better. So that really does prove our point in our topic sentence. What we're trying to prove here is the artificial beauty was placed as more valuable and higher esteem than the artificial bird. One more, for you must perceive, my chief lord and emperor, with a real nightingale, we can never tell what's going to be sung. But with this bird, everything is settled. It can be opened and explained. People may understand how the waltzes are formed and why one note follows upon another. So they're justifying why they should like the artificial one over the real one. So your job is to pick the best three. Which three do you think really do explain that the bejeweled artificial nightingale replacement was more highly valued by the emperor and his court? Choose any three. So when you do a quote, it's always in the middle. So you're going to put something on top and something on the bottom. So you're going to make a claim in this part of the story, right? Or at the beginning of the story. It's very clear, and it could be the emperor. It's highly valued. The artificial bird is highly valued. I mean, the fact that he's had it sleep right by his bedside, to the left of him, and that could be a different quote you could use as well. Body two, the fairy tale purposely depicts how only a select few find the natural beauty of the nightingale to be more valuable than anything else. So in one of these trees lived a nightingale who sang, and I'm on the bottom, so beautifully that even the poor fisherman who had so many other things to do would stop and listen. Okay, that's at the beginning of the story. Travelers from every country in the world came to the city of the emperor, which they admired very much, as well as the palace and the gardens. But when they heard the nightingale, they all declared it to be the best of all. Again, I think that one's better than the first one. So this next one is really, really long, and I want to show you why you don't use the whole quote. There's no rule that says you have to use the whole quote. What you need to do is use that part of the quote that supports your claim. So in the story, Remember the cavalier is looking all over the palace for the nightingale. He's like, where is it? And a little girl's like, I know where it is. So this is their encounter in the palace. Oh, yes, I know the nightingale quite well. Indeed, she can sing. Every evening I have permission to take home to my poor sick mother the scraps from the table. She lives down by the seashore, and as I come back, I feel tired, and I sit down in the wood to rest and listen to the nightingale's song. Then the tears come into my eyes, and it's just as if my mother kissed me. The only really valuable part of that quote is, as you could say, as she's coming back home, maybe even by the seashore, you could just summarize that part. Here's what the little girl told him, quote, I feel tired and I sit down in the wood to rest and listen to the nightingale's song. Then the tears come into my eyes and it's just as if my mother kissed me. And this clearly shows she understands the value. The nightingale sang so sweetly that the tears came into the emperor's eyes and rolled down his cheeks as her song became still more touching and went to everyone's heart. This is so integral to the story. It's the reason the nightingale came back at the end. He did value her. He just, he got lost in the artificial bird. A poor fisherman who'd heard the real nightingale said, this is about the artificial one. It sounds prettily enough, and the melodies are alike. There seems something wanting. I can't tell exactly what. So remember the fisherman at the beginning of the story, he stops working. Then he hears the artificial bird and he's like, it's wanting. It's not the same. So you wouldn't have known that if I hadn't given you the context, which is why you have to give the context when you're using textual references. You must always remain with me, said the emperor. You shall sing only when it pleases you, and I will break the artificial bird into 1,000 pieces. Now, I think it's clear that's at the end of the story. So if you're going to break the artificial bird into 1,000 pieces, I'm pretty sure that emphasizes how much he values the natural nightingale. So choose the best three, choose wisely. I think I kind of gave you an idea how to do that. So here's what you're going to prove. The fairy tale, The Nightingale by Hans Christian Andersen, presents a timely message about how although beauty can be created artificially, it often cannot compare to the beauty found in nature, as shown with specific scenes in the text. And there is a reason I don't want to lead into conclusion. These essays for the entire month have really been not so great. And this is really hard. This is really challenging. And I'm asking you to do it for a 5-page story. You will have a teacher that asks you to do it for a 400-page book. And you're going to have to explain where in that book, what's going on. Now, I'm not asking you to summarize the story. What I'm asking you is to explain the scene where that quote is being said and how it proves your claim. All right. So 2 body paragraphs. Please use the topic sentences. Now you'll notice I didn't give you end sentences. Let's see if you can do that on your own. Remember the end sentence. What are the 3 points and what did they all prove? These 3 excerpts from the story, clearly explain how not just the emperor, but the entire Chinese court valued the artificial bird over the real nightingale. So I just gave you one. All right. This concludes lesson number 3. Have a great week.